to explore that are in the field of horticulture, you can see my name, phone number, and email address there. I work at the Cooperative Extension Office in Bolivia Government Center, and we are there for these kinds of programs to help you with those horticulture problems. So I assume you're going to take care of admitting people as they sign on. So before we start, there are a couple of points to make about pruning that I wanted to make in general. They're kind of cornerstones for this thing. The first of those is that pruning is a regular part of your yard and lawn maintenance. In fact, it is the part of lawn and yard maintenance that you will spend the greatest amount of time doing. There is no day through the year that you can walk through your yard and there won't be some pruning task that is necessary to perform. Second, we tend to think of pruning only the canopies of trees. Pruning involves the pruning of branches, seed pods, flowers, buds, and roots, as well as the canopy of the plant. So you can't think of pruning as a remedial correction of an overlooked problem. Let's start with this. This is a picture. It's obviously late fall, early winter. These crepe myrtles look like they're about to be pruned. The lopper's laying on the ground. There I go around the corner of the house. As I'm walking around the corner of the house, my wife opens the front door and says, "What are you getting ready to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to prune those crepe myrtles." "Well, why are you doing that now?" And my answer at that point in time was, well, I drove into the neighborhood yesterday and I saw that the landscape people who maintain the common areas in our neighborhood were pruning the crepe myrtles, so that must be the right thing to do. That is probably one of the worst reasons for pruning that was ever invented. What the neighbor just did, what the people taking care of the common areas in the neighborhood are doing, are not sufficient justification for pruning. You need to have a good reason for pruning. You need to know why you're pruning. And certainly, as I mentioned earlier, since pruning is the most labor intensive and the gardening task that you'll spend the most amount of time doing, it's wise of you to think of ways to minimize the amount of pruning that you have to perform. Well, how do I do that? Well, I do that through plant selection and plant placement. If someone put a ruby loropetalum in front of my dining room window as a foundation planting, I'm going to have to do a lot of pruning because that thing is going to get to be 12 feet tall and it's going to block the view coming out of the window. So it's mandatory that you always think about the mature size of the plant and look up to see what the plant's going to grow into and look around to see what it's going to grow to cover up. If you don't do that, it is entirely possible for you to create a problem that you can't solve by pruning. So what are the reasons for pruning? What are the justifiable reasons for pruning? And there are many. Certainly, one of the most important is the maintenance and improvement of vigor of a plant. Every time you cut a plant, you send a growth signal to that plant, and it will respond by growing. You may want to control size and form of a plant. You may be espaliering a plant or a camellia on a brick wall in your yard. And it's also true that you can influence flower and fruit production with pruning. Anyone who has worked in an apple orchard knows that you can increase the size of the fruit and the quality of the fruit by pruning half of the fruit off of the tree. Each tree has a fixed amount of energy, and that energy, if you prune a bunch of the fruit off, will go to the remaining fruit that's there. You can do the same thing with flowers. You can get bigger hydrangea blooms by doing that same kind of thing. The other more obvious reasons for pruning are the structural and safety considerations. Certainly, if you have any dead, diseased, or damaged wood in a plant, that ought to be pruned out, and it ought to be pruned out as soon as you see it. Fiddlers need to be removed from plants. Those are limbs that rub against each other. They'll create a canker or a callus, which is an entry point for both disease and insect problems. And oftentimes you'll end up with narrow included angles between branches of a plant. And that is a weak structure. A Bradford pear tree is probably the best example. Bradford pear trees and tropical storms here on the coastal plain don't get along very well. The reason is the tree is very, very weak, and it's very weak because it has a growth habit of having very narrow included angles. And when we get wind, many of those branches break off, contrasted with a live oak. And oftentimes in a live oak, the included angle between branches is 75 to 90 degrees, and that's a much stronger structure. We'll touch a little bit on plant pruning at transplanting. The idea, as you move on the cartoon from left to right, is that you take a plant and you do in fact reduce the size of the root mass on the plant. When you take it out, you either ball and burlap it or you put it in a pot. The only thing you really ought to be concerned with at that point in time, though, is the structure of the plant. If it's got a double leader, eliminate the double leader. If it's got any dead, diseased branches, get rid of those. If it has crossing limbs, get rid of those. If it has water sprouts, get rid of those. I was taught a long time ago that anytime I transplant a plant, I need to reduce the size of the canopy to better balance the size of the root ball that I took with it so that I have better balance between the two. Do not do that here. That canopy of a plant is in fact the food factory for that plant. And when you transplant a plant, you want it to adapt to its new environment as quickly as it can, and you therefore want its food factory making as much food and nourishment for that plant as you can. So don't reduce the size of the canopy when you're transplanting. Just work the structure. So let's shift gears and talk about when do I prune, because that's oftentimes a perplexing question around here. And there are lots of different plants, and the plants that flower give us a clue as to when to prune them. If your plant blooms and puts out flowers in the spring, that plant more than likely is flowering on one-year-old wood, wood that grew the previous season and set buds the previous season. For those plants, you prune them after the flowering period, immediately after the flowering period. Things like azaleas, forsythias, and the rest that you can see there on the bottom. The rule of thumb about spring flowering is June 1st. Now, bear in mind, it's almost impossible to tell when spring arrives on the coastal plain. It certainly has absolutely nothing to do with the calendar. But you can use June 1st as a rule of thumb or as a guideline. If this plant blooms and puts out flowers before June 1st, then it's blooming on old wood and you prune it after it bloomed. Contrasting, if it blooms in the summer, it's flowering on current growth or growth that generated that year, earlier in that year. Things like crepe myrtles, things like spirea or Japanese spirea. And on those plants, you prune them before that growth begins. So typically we'll prune those plants in February or March before the new growth spurt begins. Obviously, there are exceptions to this rule of thumb. An oak leaf hydrangea blooms later in the summer, but it is blooming on old wood, so it needs to be pruned immediately afterwards, after blooming. And just for reference, I've included a couple of slides of expanded list of new wood bloomers and old wood bloomers. So then we move into plants, the broadleaf evergreens. Broadleaf evergreens are things like hollies and boxwoods, ligustrums, wax myrtles. We use a lot of these for foundation plants. These plants are pretty tough, and they'll take heavy pruning before their growth spurt begins in the early part of the year. They'll take light pruning anytime during the year. In fact, a broadleaf evergreen plant, you can cut it off at the ground and it oftentimes will regenerate. itself. When we're talking about conifers or evergreens, we all have headed back branches from the top to the bottom in the winter to use for holiday decorations. If you're dealing with pine, spruce, juniper, or fir, you cannot cut a branch deeper than half of the foliage. Those particular varieties will not regenerate foliage, contrasted with leyland cypress and some of the spruce trees that will regenerate. If you're trying to control the size of one of these kind of plants in your yard, the best thing to do is just to pinch the pine candles off of the end of the branches at the beginning of the year. So what are some special considerations then for pruning? Well, we talked about pruning stimulates growth, and you can certainly encourage growth, and you would do that just before a spring flush if you're trying to. Well, you can also use that principle to help you with things like wax myrtles. Wax myrtles take a lot of pruning through the year. They grow very rapidly. So if I wanted to use pruning to slow down that growth, I would pick the hottest, most miserable day in the summer when the humidity was well above 90% and the afternoon sun was baking that tree or that plant, and that's when I would prune it heavily. I would severely stress that plant, but I will achieve what I set out to do, and that's to inhibit its growth and slow it down. Some plants bleed, maples, birches, elms, and dogwoods. That doesn't hurt anything to prune the plant if it's bleeding, but it does make a mess out of your pruning tools, so you may want to pick a point in time later in the year like June in order to prune those particular trees. Many of us moved down here from up north, so it's appropriate to always ask the question, when is the absolute worst time to do your pruning here in the coastal plain? And the answer to that is the worst time of all to do it is the fall and early winter. If you remember the picture that we started this presentation with, I was going to go out and prune that crepe myrtle in the late fall, early winter. The reason for that are the weather patterns that we have here. Our transition seasons from fall to winter are characterized oftentimes with 75-degree days and 30-degree nights. And if you prune a plant during that period, you will stimulate growth that will not have sufficient time to harden off before it faces that 30-degree night, and you will actually end up declimatizing the plant. It will get confused and stressed about when it's supposed to grow and when it's not supposed to grow. I'm going to shift gears and move into pruning techniques now. But before we start pruning techniques, we got to spend a little bit of time with the physiology of a plant. So here's a typical, this is obviously a rosebush stem over here on the right. And it's typical, it characterizes what we need to pay attention to when we're pruning. There will be a terminal bud on the end of a stem. And when we cut that terminal bud off, we force a plant to release an enzyme called auxin, and that auxin is what stimulates growth, and it'll normally stimulate growth in the next closest buds down the stem, these lateral buds that are here. So it's also true, just while we're here on this picture, you know that you can count rings on a hardwood plant in order to judge growth. Well, you can oftentimes count the node rings, this ring right here that ends this inner node, and you can tell the age of that stem. This is the part of the stem that grew in the first year, and then this is the part of the stem that grew in the following year. So you can get some idea of how old the limb is or how old the stem is just from counting the rings on the internodes of the plant. Well, Since we stimulate growth when we prune, it's important to make a pruning cut that is properly made. And a good pruning cut is a cut that is made 1/4 of an inch from the bud that you're trying to stimulate growth in. Well, this gives us a lot of control over size and shape and proportion of a plant when we're pruning it. So all we really have to do is go down a limb to a bud that's pointing in the direction that we want the new growth to go. And then we make a pruning cut about 1/4 of an inch above that bud, and we make that pruning cut parallel to the axis of the bud. That will stimulate growth of this bud, and as it grows, the diameter of this stem will grow until it eventually blends with this cut, and all you'll have is a little elbow in the stem. This gives us the ability now to take a broad, wide, short plant and make it a little narrower and a little taller. We can also do the reverse and make a plant that's too tall spread out a little wider and not grow as tall just by the selection of the buds we make. Now, this is labor intensive. You're looking at each and every stem and going down to pick the bud that you want to identify the growth direction that you want that limb to take. All of these down here are examples of ways not to make the cut. You can't make a straight cut. You can get the cut too close to the bud. You can make it backwards and therefore not complement that growth of the bud that you're stimulating. You can make it too sharp and you end up with a weak corner. You can make a jagged cut, but there is a way to make the correct cut. When we do this kind of pruning, it is called heading back. Heading back is sliding down a limb or a branchlet to a bud and then cutting above that bud. That shortens the individual stems. We do this in order to increase the density of the canopy of the plant that we're dealing with. But we need to be cautious, because when we do that and that canopy grows, we can oftentimes put the bottom of the plant that's below where we're cutting in the shade. And if we put the bottom part of a plant in the shade, it will oftentimes react to that by dropping that foliage, since that foliage can't get any sun in order to photosynthesize and generate starch for the plant to live on. Another pruning technique is called thinning out. When we're thinning out, we're oftentimes dealing with the dead, diseased, and the damaged wood that's in a plant, or the fiddlers. This involves the complete removal of branches back to the lateral, main trunk, or the ground even. And we do this to open the canopy. Good example of this would be a spirea or even a versithia. They generate lots and lots of branches that are closely clustered together. And we need to go in and remove some of those branches every now and then for several reasons. It increases the amount of sunlight that gets into the center of the plant, and it also increases the airflow around the plant. Both of those are needed to help the plant bloom more and resist disease. We have high humidity here, and having good airflow through our plants helps reduce the amount of fungal, especially leaf spot problems that you'll have to deal with. So once again, this thinning out is what we do to open up the canopy, and it lets us begin to control size and natural appearance. Now, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So here we have on the left an example of thinning pruning, and on the right an example of heading back pruning, and both of these pictures are wrong. If we're pruning shrubs and thinning them, we're removing branches. We go back down to the next larger branch and we cut it. Don't ever leave these little nubbins. We're going to talk about the branch collar here in a minute. You need to not leave these little short stubs. You need to cut it right at the branch collar, or else the plant will try to grow from that stubborn rather than emitting the enzyme that'll help it skin over and heal itself right at the cut. The heading back type of pruning If we always cut on the same plane, what we'll end up with is a very thin canopy, especially if we do it year after year after year. So when you're heading back, you need to maintain a more natural look of the plant, and that would cause us to go down maybe to this bud on this limb and maybe have cut this one up here, go a little deeper. So stay at a lot of different levels. Don't get one smooth, isolated plane through there. It's also true that with most of the plants that we use for landscape planting, you need to alternate between heading back and thinning to avoid the thin canopy, and also to give the plant a chance to get more airflow during the year by thinning. So use both techniques and alternate. I used the word renewal planting a little while ago. This applies primarily to broadleaf evergreen plants. And they're tough plants. And let's go back and talk about the ruby loropetalum that I mentioned in front of the dining room window that is now 8 feet tall, and I can't see out the dining room window. Well, I'll just go in and pull the plant out. Well, I kind of like having a plant there, and I don't want to start over. When you've got a situation like that, you need to start thinking about renewal pruning. And with this type of a plant, which is a broadleaf evergreen, you can cut that plant down to 6 or 12 inches from the ground, which means it will have absolutely no foliage left on it whatsoever. You would do this in the spring before the spring growth spurt begins. That heavy a cut will cause that plant to react immediately, and it will stimulate abundant new growth. And by midsummer, you'll be able to go in, and once those shoots are 6 to 12 inches long, you can prune the tips and begin to head back to cause the plant to fill in and be dense down close to the ground. And then after that next batch of growth occurs, you do the same thing again, and you begin to shape and restructure that plant, and you have gained control over it without having to rip it out of the ground. Talk about trees for a minute. Don't ever let anybody do this to a tree. If they're using words like topping, hat racking, lion tailing, crown thinning, don't do it. You can see what happens when you do this to a tree. It responds immediately to try to regenerate a food factory, and it sends up these water sprouts, which are extremely weak. These trees are all dead. They just don't know it yet. Now, unfortunately, this is oftentimes done because of height considerations. And if you're in a situation where you have to do that, there's a right way to do it, and it's called drop crotching. And in that case, you don't just, regardless of the of where the buds are on the tree, start whacking it. You slide down a branch till you get a cross branch that's about 1/3 the diameter of this one, and you cut it there. It's a form of heading back, if you will. And that's the proper way to thin the tree out. Most of us don't have to worry about that. Most of us live in additions now that have below ground power lines. But if you do get into a situation like this, think about this type of pruning. You could get into this kind of a situation with a wrong species crepe myrtle that was planted too close to your house overhang, and it's banging on the eave troughs now, so you have to control it. Its height. Back about 1760, crepe myrtles were introduced to the South in Charleston. And somehow between then and now, the notion developed that you have to prune crepe myrtles to make them bloom. It is not true. In fact, it's harmful. And this series of pictures on these next 2 slides deals with, these are actually at an administration building in Charlotte. These were 2 identical crepe myrtles. They were both the same size. And the experiment was, we'll prune one and leave the other one alone. So this was March of 2001. Then in April, you can see that the much more desirable plant is the one that we didn't prune. In June, that's still the case. And later, when the tree bloomed, we're getting a nice crepe myrtle plant here, and this one that we pruned is still struggling, trying to generate enough foliage so that it can make food for itself. Well, okay, but what about the following year? In the following year, we left them alone. And this was March, this was April. And then when they finally bloomed, I would still much prefer the tree that we did not prune. Now, I'm not sure how it all got started. I suspicion that it gives landscape companies something to do, is to prune these crepe myrtles. It is true that when you prune a crepe myrtle, you will get fewer blooms. They may be a little bit bigger. Maybe that's what folks were doing. It is true that with a crepe myrtle, when these blooms start to turn brown, before they turn completely brown, if you'll deadhead the crepe myrtle, you can oftentimes tease another bloom out of a crepe myrtle. But the advice I would give on pruning crepe myrtles is be concerned with structure and structure only. So you can make a crepe myrtle a single trunk tree, you can make it a multiple trunk tree, you can make it a shrub, you can make it a bush. You need to always take the dead, diseased, and damaged and fiddlers out of a crepe myrtle, but do not, or try to, as best you can, avoid the practice of pruning a crepe myrtle at the same spot every year. They lose their natural shape by doing that, and they develop these big knuckles at that point where you prune them, which to me are unsightly. Now, once again, if I have a crepe myrtle and it was the wrong plant in the wrong place and it's banging on the eave troughs, I may not have an option other than prune it to top it each year to cut it back down. But the recommendation, once again, is crepe myrtles do not need to be pruned in order to make them bloom. It's a myth. If you have young trees, what you ought to be concerned with is their structure and their shape, and you want that structure to be balanced. And the ideal structure for a young tree is limbs that radiate out from the trunk around the full 360 degrees of the perimeter of the tree, and they spiral up that trunk and fan out. As they do that, you want to avoid things like double leaders and or splits that trap a bark wedge. Whoop. Hold on a minute. Maybe I can go backwards. If you have eastern redbud trees in your yard, they have a tendency to want to send up a second leader, and this will happen within 2 or 3 feet of the ground, and they will trap a big wedge of bark in there, making them a very weak structure. So you want to try and avoid that to the extent you can. And you don't want limbs radiating in the same plane. This would be like a human holding their arms out. You'd like to have one of these in a perpendicular plane to the plane of these. This also applies when you're selecting a tree to buy. Pick one that has good structure. Look at it, walk around 90 degrees, look at it from that side, and to the extent you can, look at it from the top to make sure you have limbs radiating out around the full 360 degree perimeter of the tree. When we're maintaining trees, we like to keep the major limbs at narrow angles removed. We want to take out inward growing branches. You'll often find that on crepe myrtles. They tend to want to have limbs growing inward. Downward growing branches. Persimmon trees love to send limbs down toward the ground for some reason. Of course, you're taking out the damaged, diseased branches and any shoots, suckers, or water sprouts that you have, and any competing leaders. It is not uncommon at all to try to prune a large branch off of a tree, and as you're sawing through the limb's weight causes it to break, and it tears off a big chunk of bark down the side of the tree. There is a way to cut a large limb off of a tree and have that not happen, but it involves making 3 cuts rather than 1. So you want to cut this limb off, you move out about 12 inches on the limb and make a cut from the bottom, and only cut up to the point where the saw begins to bind, which means the weight of the limb is starting to pinch the saw. Once you've reached that point, go out another 3 or 4 inches and start cutting from the top down through the limb. This weight of this limb will still cause this limb to fall and split, but then it will split between the bottom of these 2 cuts and not tear bark off the trunk of the tree. Then you go make a 3rd cut and you come into the branch collar and you make the finished cut right across the surface of the branch collar, the face of the branch collar. You'll save yourself a lot of damage to trees by doing that. And I mentioned cutting at the branch collar. You never want to cut a limb off by sawing straight down through this plane. If you do that, you inhibit the natural healing enzymes that the tree can generate. What you want to do is this swollen, enlarged area where a limb meets the trunk, you want to cut down the face of that. It's called the branch collar, and that cut will go from the trunk and down and out from the tree. I've got a better picture of this a little bit later in the presentation. What about wound dressings? In Brunswick County, North Carolina, never even think about using a wound dressing. It will trap material. It will trap material that, like moisture, that will accelerate the rotting of the stump or the stub that's just below that wound dressing. In fact, some of the sealants that are used for wound dressing will even kill the cambial layer of cells that are in the tree at that layer. And it gets so hot here in the summer, it's going to crack in the summer anyway. So you're just wasting your time with wound dressing. If you're pruning hedges, well, not just hedges. Anytime you're pruning a plant like a broadleaf evergreen, try to keep the top of it narrower than the bottom. That way you get sun to the bottom of the plant and you avoid this phenomenon where it thins out down at the bottom. Even a boxwood hedge should be pruned as more of with these slants. And these don't have to be great. 10 degrees or so is more than enough to get sunlight down to the bottom of the plant. This 3-year development pruning, if you're starting a new hedge, you need to prune the top of it and then head it back to make sure that you've got branches growing out down here on the bottom and filling in with foliage down there before you let it begin to grow up a little higher, and you repeat that. And of course, on that second stage, you would cut it back narrower so you continue to get sun down to the bottom of the plant. Okay, I'm going to switch and start talking a little bit about pruning tools. And of course, the most important consideration on pruning tools is motivating your most primary pruning tool. Once you've got that person motivated, you need to have three things in your arsenal of pruning. You need to have hand pruners, you need to have loppers, and you need to have a pruning saw. Hand pruners we're all familiar with. They come as both bypass and anvil cutters. The bypass cutter makes a cleaner cut. These tend to be more expensive than the anvil cutters. They both will do the job. You can get closer to the branch collar with the bypass cutters than you can the anvil cutter. If you happen to have a lot of arthritis in your hand, the anvil cutter gives you more mechanical advantage. It's a little bit easier to use. Those same statements apply to the loppers. You're going to use the hand pruners for branches that are less than 1/2 inch, and you're going to use the loppers for branches that go up to 1 inch. Do not violate those constraints. You can spring these the cutting edges and lose the you'll misform the space between the two cutting heads with a gap, and you'll find that when you start to cut, you'll trap branches and the like in there, and it'll get aggravating. The third tool that I talked about that you need to have is a hand saw, and a pruning saw is an excellent investment. Pruning saws are unique in that they cut on the pull stroke, not the push stroke. And since most of the time you're cutting up over your head, that's an important consideration. Earlier I mentioned the branch collar. This is a better picture of a branch collar. Any branch comes down, and when it meets the next larger limb or trunk, there will be a swollen area in there. That's called the branch collar. And as this limb grows and the trunk grows, there will be a bark ridge trapped in there. When you're pruning, removing one of these, you want to cut right across this plane on the face of the branch collar. If you do that, the wound that you see will be perfectly round. If you get too close or too far away, it'll be more eyeball shaped. If you get an eyeball shaped cut, there's nothing you can do about it, but at least you know you did it wrong that way. If you cut it properly, then the natural healing enzymes of the tree will take care, or any plant for that matter, will take care of skinning over and protecting the tree from both fungal and insect penetration at that point. And of course, the reason we do that is if we cut off these little stubs or nubbins, then we still get meristemic cells that will try and generate growth, and you'll get the plant trying to recover and grow more foliage from those spots, which is not what you want. Keeping your tool sharp is important when you're pruning. If you sharpen your pruning tools yourself, you do not want to file on the flat side of these blades. That's the part, those are the two cutting surfaces, and they're parallel to each other, and you want them to stay with as narrow a gap between the two as you can. When you're sharpening, you need to sharpen on the beveled side of the blade. So take your stone or your file or whatever you're using to sharpen the tool with, and only use it on the beveled side. Incidentally, when you're pruning, it's a good idea, especially if you are pruning a diseased plant, to sterilize your pruners between each and every cut. And you can do that with bleach and water, or you can do it with little Lysol wipes. And if you do this, then you don't spread the disease. And this always leads to the question of, well, my landscape guy doesn't do that. And no, they don't. It's pretty labor intensive to be doing it that way. And landscape people can make money by coming back and spraying fungicides on plants that they may have infected by not sterilizing their pruning tools. And that is a more efficient solution for them than trying to sterilize the tools in between each cut. Now, I only do this when I'm pruning on a plant that is really in bad shape with a severe fungal infestation of some kind. When I'm pruning healthy plants, I don't bother with doing that. So then the final thoughts I want to leave you with are, don't be afraid to cut plants and prune them. They are very forgiving. And the thing that you need to be most concerned with is setting structure early in your plant's life. If you do it right the first couple of years of the plant life, you'll save yourself a lot of grief later in the plant life. So that's the last slide in the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see what kinds of things we have on the chat in terms of questions. So one of the questions I see is, okay to cut suckers at the base of a crepe myrtle? Absolutely, cut them off. And crepe myrtles will do that throughout about the first 5 to 10 years of their life. They eventually will stop doing that. But all those suckers should be cut out. Incidentally, that's a good way to get free plants. They're easy to root if you cut them. Is it okay to periodically give a haircut to Loropetalum and Podocarpus just to shape up? Yes, you can do that with any broadleaf evergreen. You can prune them any day of the year as a light cut. If you're going to do a rejuvenation pruning, you would do that in the spring, just before the spring growth flush. When do you prune or transplant lavender? Once again, once lavender's blooms start to turn brown, that's when I would prune it and cut it back. And I would transplant it in February for the same reason that we talked about earlier. If you transplant annuals or perennials in the fall, oftentimes they will start to grow because our ground temperature never gets below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So it doesn't freeze. And so oftentimes plants will be stimulated into growth and they'll hit those transition seasons and they'll get cold damaged. So for that reason, well, I'm running off in lots of different directions here. For that reason, you would do that in January, February. That's also the reason that although you buy bulbs in the fall, you don't plant them in the fall here because of that. They'll start to grow too soon. You need to store them and plant them in January or February so that they can get established and not get cold damaged with too early a growth. We have several wax myrtles that need rejuvenation. We trimmed one to less than a foot about 1 month ago as an experiment. It is growing nicely, but based on what you said, we should have waited. Is there a way to protect or overwinter? It would just be, you're in luck. Wax myrtles are absolutely indestructible. That's what makes them such a wonderful plant here. Okay. And wax myrtles also spread by below ground roots. They will send up new plants from roots that are down below. So you'll be okay with your wax myrtle. Can you talk about cleaning and sterilizing pruning equipment to stop disease spreading? Yeah, we mentioned it briefly. It's always a good idea certainly to sterilize your tools when you're done pruning each time. It's a good idea to sterilize your tools after each cut if you're working on a diseased plant. You can use a 1 to 10 solution of Clorox and water to sterilize your tools. You can use alcohol to sterilize your tools. If I'm working on a diseased plant, I'll take a canister of these Lysol wipes with me, and I'll just wipe the blades after each cut with those. And that's handy, and I haven't got a bucket of some sort of solution I'm trying to carry around the yard. So that works well that way. What about pruning osmanthus and tea olive now? It's a little bit early, but if you're doing a light pruning just to shape, it's okay. You're talking about a broadleaf evergreen, it'll be all right to do it now. I would, if you're going to do a heavier pruning, I would once again wait until the January, February timeframe. If someone else dug up and divided cannas now, okay to put in ground or dig back out and store in garage? I'd put them in a brown paper bag. I'd throw a little baby powder in there as a fungicide, and I would wait and plant them later in the year. Typically it's like November now. Fall keeps getting later and spring keeps getting earlier. But after Thanksgiving, you're probably safe at planting any of those kind of plants that generate from bulbs, and not have to worry about them growing and starting to send foliage up and then hit our cold weather that would freeze them. How to shorten a 10-foot tall spruce?
Someone.
Well, as we were talking about earlier, with a spruce tree, you can cut those limbs back and take the cone of the tree. You can cut those limbs back, but don't take more than half the foliage off of any limb, and that will shorten it a bit. If you're in a situation where you got a 10-foot tree someplace where you ought to have a 5-foot tree, it may be that you've got the wrong plant in the wrong place. And if shortening it is the only way you can control it, you might think about getting rid of it and replacing it with something that doesn't grow that tall in that particular location. Not sure how to thin out my Japanese maple. Japanese maples are a tree, so you can treat them, you can either head them back or you can thin them out. You have to decide what you want. Do you want a tree? Many Japanese maples look more like shrubs. They can be a bush if you want. But you can use the same thinning and heading back techniques that we had talked about. There are some pretty sophisticated ways of pruning Japanese maples that involve using hot wire rather than a saw. That's not something I'm familiar with, so I'm not going to say anything more about it, but you can explore that online if you choose to. Do you know of a place to take tools to have them sharpened?
Good question.
There are a couple of places in Wilmington. There are none in Southport or Charlotte that I know of. And they don't come to mind right now, but if you go online and look for small tool sharpening, you'll find them online. Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. Someone wanted me to turn up the volume.
Me.
Who was that? Was that you, Sue?
No, it wasn't me.
I can't turn up your volume, but you can turn up your own volume on your own machine, for what that's worth. I think I've touched all the questions. Are there any other questions that anyone has?
I'm going to ask a question, Tom, that if you have boxwood that has blight, is pruning it going to save the plant?
Maybe.
That was conditional.
I don't recommend boxwood here on the coastal plain at all. We have a special scale insect called boxwood scale. We have a moth that feeds exclusively on boxwood, and boxwood does get boxwood blight here. So it's a difficult plant to try and deal with, and it will take much attention on your part. You'll always be looking for the right fungicide or the right insecticide to use on it. Yes, if parts of the plant are turning brown, you always prune those out just as quickly as you can, because it's a disease and it's spreading. It tends to spread from the tip back in toward the center of the plant. So the sooner you can get that pruned out of there, the better for the plant. But you're in an environment that you're going to have boxwood blight if you have boxwood plants every year. It will always be there.
Any other questions? There are two more questions, Tom, I think that people typed in.
There's a fellow who comes to the New Hanover Arboretum periodically and sets up in their parking lot. Hey, great, thank you. May want to check with the Arboretum. This is from Carol saying that at New Hanover, there's a person who comes and sharpens tools. Is that right, Carol? Okay. And then the last one, can you grow or prune Yopon holly to be like boxwood? You absolutely can do that, and it's a great choice. In my front yard, I have two hedges around the half moon shapes between the house and the walk that are knee high, 14 to 18 inches high and about a foot wide. And they are dwarf Yopon holly. And I have to prune them a couple times a year to keep them small. As you know, a dwarf Yopon holly can get pretty doggone big if you let it go. But yes, and it's a great substitute for hedge. And you can use, there are two varieties of dwarf Yopon holly. And I've forgotten the name of one of them. One of them, the leaves turn reddish in the fall, and that's kind of a nice thing to have for a hedge also, gives you a little more variety.
Okay, I guess we don't have any more questions. That was awesome, Tom. Really wonderful. I think we learned a great deal.
Well, thank you for inviting me to talk with your group.
I hope we can have you back again and again. And I do want to tell the members that Tom has been nice enough to tell me that we could record this, and we have. So I will get it out to you in case you couldn't write fast enough to keep up with Tom, or you couldn't sketch fast enough to sketch the wonderful exhibits he had of trees. So again, Tom, thank you. It's been awesome.
You're welcome. You all have a great day today.
Thank you. All right,
Bye
ladies, I'll see you all in November for our virtual trip to Airlie. Have a wonderful fall.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you.
You're always at the bottom. Why are they always at the bottom?